You'll know that if you listen to the podcast live, every month we have amazing low-tox businesses helping you with your swaps or stock-ups. Check out the 2 offers we have below, both for Aussies, with the Edible Beauty offer also being for our US watchers and listeners. Enjoy. Hello, Adam. How are you?
Good. How are you, Alex?
I'm awesome, thank you. And I am thrilled to be hosting this conversation. I have been thinking a lot about cults and propaganda over the past few years. And the first thing that kind of got me thinking about it again was when my 12-year-old boy said, Mum, a couple of the guys at school are talking about this guy called Andrew Tate, who's really good at teaching us how to make money. And I was like, okay, we're going to have to go down that road.
Sure.
And so we watched documentaries, we talked about Waco, Texas, which was something that happened when I was a young adult, and then other cult leaders, Hitler. We did some study. We had some tough, long conversations. And I just wanted him to understand how you can end up stopping to fact check someone. Like,
Sure.
at what point do you just believe everything someone says, even
Yeah.
if it goes against values you held just a couple of years ago? It's a fascinating thing. And this is literally what you have dedicated a huge part of your life to.
Yeah, it's not just something that I have a professional stake in. I also have a personal stake in it too.
Mm.
As I discuss in my book, To Hell with Heaven, it's part philosophical and it's part autobiographical. Um, with my background as a constitutional lawyer and a political philosopher, I care about these topics because I care about the good of the republic. I care about democracy and I care about the betterment of society. But there's also the personal aspect in the fact that I was raised in what I believe to be a cult. I was raised in Mormonism. It was mainstream Mormonism, but it was still the Mormonism of Southeast Idaho, rural background community. I was fourth generation on both sides of my family. And it is an interesting question to wonder at what point does the brain shut off and start to say, all right, this other person knows better than I do, and I will believe everything that they say. And I'm willing to sacrifice my own worldview in the name of their worldview. I think what it often comes down to, and maybe this is just a good way to enter into this conversation, this is actually, I think, where it becomes very easy to see a political overlap here. I think that human beings have two warring factions within us. We have a desire to live a free life. We want to be autonomous. We want to express ourselves. We want to self-actualize, and we want to not be told what to do. We chafe at that. Even as kids, we chafe at the idea of following rules and having to obey authority. On the other hand, there is a part of us that desires to be nurtured, wants to feel safe. We want to feel secure. I want to know that at the end of the day, I have a home to go back to, and I want to feel a sense of belonging. We are, at the end of the day, social creatures,
Hmm.
and those two things are tugging against one of us.
Yeah, it's like lizard brain versus explorer brain, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. And I think for the cultist, for the cult leader especially, trying to emphasize that part that is playing on the safety piece. So at the end of the day, what we're really talking about is just authoritarianism. So the authoritarian in the room says, you don't have to do the thinking. It's too hard to have to connect the dots yourself. It's too hard to do the kind of rational, deductive reasoning. So I'm going to do the thinking for you. And you can feel safe knowing, like a mother or a parent would, you can feel safe in knowing that I know better. I can be paternalistic about this, and you can kind of cede some of your freedom over to me in exchange for safety or security or whatever it is. And
Hmm.
I think that just that beginning, just that little entry point is a way, especially when you come to a cult as an adult. I think that's a really easy way for cult leaders to capitalize on. Now, there's more to it than that, but I think that that's the beginning of it.
Can I draw a parallel? As you were talking there, Adam, I was thinking about how the food company swooped in during the feminist uprising of the 70s and said, you don't need to cook. We'll take that off your hands. It was such a seductive message for women who wanted to give of themselves in a force context, who wanted to start businesses and finally could, who finally didn't have to get their husbands to sign off on any kind of investments or credit card. And I really feel like the food industry was a cult leader in that time to make us think, well, they wouldn't possibly do anything wrong. They're here to help us make dinner easy for our families. And that was so seductive. Is that the kind of seduction you're talking about that happens in authoritarianism as well?
Absolutely. I think so. There is a long history in the, especially in developed worlds, developed parts of the world, where capitalism and profit become the motive by which we do anything. So if
Mm,
I once got in an argument with somebody about, well, if the market demands it, it must be good. And I explained how that moral kind of thinking has got to be, it's got to be wrong. You just can't possibly conclude that everything that the market wants is right. But yeah, I think that there's plenty of examples in the technological sphere, in the food industry, in any career that you see in the 20th century, the kind of industries that have been shaken up by just changes that happen. There are promises that are made routinely. There are guarantees that, well, if you do this thing, if you buy this product, you are going to have satisfaction.
mm,
You're going to feel empowered. That's another phrase that you might hear often. And things are going to just be easier, right? You'll have more time now to do the other things
mm,
that are more important to you, right? We're going to save you time in the long run. What's ironic about it is that it actually is counterproductive to it. I think so. Herbert Marcuse is famous for talking about this in the 1960s. That he looks around the world and he says, "We've got all this technology, we've got all these changes, and none of us seem to be satisfied by it." And I think it's because we're being sold satisfaction, and that satisfaction is always a flash in the frying pan. A
mm.
new technology comes along, it promises us something. We feel it for a little while. We feel the rush of the new iPhone or the rush of the new product. And
Yeah, we
then
queue up outside the store again.
exactly. And then we
Mm,
get that dopamine hit, and then a few years later, the app starts to slow down. The washing machine starts to break, and we go out and we replace it with something else. And the promise again is more satisfaction. And so I think, yeah, there absolutely is this authoritarian streak. You can once you start looking for it, you can find it everywhere.
mm,
And it doesn't have to be weaponized in the way that it oftentimes is. I think that, there is a desire for safety and security that I think can be very benign and moral. There's nothing wrong with telling people we're going to make you secure. But when it's tied up oftentimes to things like malignant narcissism, or it's tied up to a kind of vendetta or a ulterior motive that's behind it, using people as tools for some goal, then we're starting to get into the realm of abuse. And that I think is where, so for example, food industries that perhaps are not telling you the whole truth, food industries that are hiding evidence that their promises are incomplete, that's when you start to get into the realm of, okay, this is no longer just selling us security and hope. This is now selling me something that's much darker than that.
Pharmaceutical industry as well, right?
Right. I mean,
Mm,
if you look, for instance, at the rise in use of antidepressants, just in
mm.
my lifetime, I was born in 1984, and
Ah,
the
how
on the
poetic.
yeah, right. I mean, talk about being born under a bad sign, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I think that in my lifetime, there is certainly a place for the use of medicine, right?
Mm.
There's certainly
Oh,
there are
100%.
absolutely there are
Yeah.
absolutely justifications for using it. But we also know, and I think the data bears this out, that there is an over prescription of it, and there's a kind of this is an easy way for us to accomplish a goal.
Mm.
If you are feeling anxiety, you're feeling uncertainty about your life, you just go get an antidepressant. And doctors are encouraged to do that. I mean, I don't even think we need to recount all the
No.
documentaries and all the evidence that's been shown to do that. So I think as long as someone has this ulterior motive, whether that's a board of directors or a cult leader or even just a member of your family. I mean, this is where we can talk about things like abuse.
Mm.
There's a similarity here between the kind of generational abuse and the generational trauma that can come from feeling cloistered inside of a household. Sexual abuse can take on the same kinds of hallmarks that we would see in authoritarian regimes. So it's a phenomenon that I think is just a part of being a human, and it's the way to protect against it is to be aware of it and to call it
Mm.
out when we see it.
So, how this is a big question. I feel like I'm inviting people to a full day seminar, Adam, to preface this. But how do we become calmer, better thinkers, in your view, where we can really go, oh, interesting. Like, I find it really easy to do. Maybe because I went to uni in humanities, they bludgeon you with that many 10,000 word essays that you have to look at multiple perspectives, back up your points, come to a conclusion. Like, I had to practice doing that. How do we get people who maybe haven't had that experience to practice doing that, especially when we now live in a time where there's this authoritarian lace over academia that's happening, where that is seen as being bonkers lefty, or
Mhm.
I've never thought being really well read across multiple perspectives made me left wing. Like, I've never drawn that conclusion of myself or others. It's an interesting time to teach better thinking, I think, when there's that influence as well.
Yeah, it is a crazy time to be alive on this front. When critical thinking is seen as an ideological thing,
Yes.
then
Okay.
we're in a weird territory. So
Mm.
I mean, at the end of the day, I am a committed philosopher. I teach philosophy students. It's political philosophy. So I have intense belief in the Socratic method. It's not because I believe in Socrates. I don't need, in fact, Socrates doesn't need to have even existed for my thought process to be real. Unlike, say, Christianity, where I need Jesus to have existed for Christianity to be real. I don't need a figure that is Socrates. I just need his method. And his method, pure and simply, is to ask questions. It doesn't even have to be the right questions. The model that we see with Socrates is to simply start asking. What's interesting about it is it builds confidence. The initial question begins to unravel more questions. You ask, it can be just as something as simple as you use that term. What does that mean? And I think what oftentimes is the first hurdle for everybody on this, and it's true for me, it's true for everyone. This is not something that you just magically acquire and it comes and goes throughout your life. It's not going to be something that you're always going to be perfect at. But I think it starts first with humility. It starts first by
Mm.
admitting this admission that, okay, I might not know what this other person's talking about. I might not be aware. It
I might
happened to
not have
me.
all the facts here.
Exactly. It happened to me just last evening, for instance. We were sitting around the table. There's pressure sometimes within academic circles to act like you know what you're talking about and what
Mm.
everyone else
I'd
at the table is
imagine
talking.
so. Yeah.
Yeah, you have this incentive to look like you know what you're doing. And you feel this pressure. But I think one way that we can kind of, you know, check that a little bit is to say, everyone else is probably feeling this too. There was a gentleman that had used a term the other evening that I just did not recognize. I didn't know what that word was. And I spoke up. I said, I am unfamiliar with that term. I am unfamiliar with what you're talking about. It was something benign, tangential to what we're talking about here. But other people at the table acknowledged later on, I also didn't understand what that term was. That was the first time I'd heard that too. And what it does is it kind of deflates the anxiety in the room. It reduces that feeling of, okay, I've got to be perfect. I've got to
Mm.
have all the knowledge in front of me. And so I think it starts by us acknowledging our own humility. I think it
Mm-hmm.
starts by us modeling that kind of behavior for others. It's an interesting thing that once you start to ask questions of other people, they start to pick up on that. We're interesting social creatures in that respect because
Mm.
we start to model behavior that we see. I think it also starts too by teaching our children that. I have a 6-year-old, and it's hard because you you want to answer their questions. You want to say, all right, well, you've peppered me with 1,000 questions today. Here's the answer, and then let's be done because I'm feeling overstimulated. But leaning into that feeling of, well, let's explore it. Let's see if we can find an answer to
It's
this, right?
making me laugh as you say that because I'll never forget a day when, about 10 years ago, my son was 5 at the time, and he was a dinosaur fanatic, like absolute fanatic. This kid could tell you everything about Cretaceous and all the different periods, how long they went for. And at the start of this fanaticism, he mentions a Giganotosaurus.
Oh
And I'm
boy.
like, sweetheart, we don't need to go and make up names for dinosaurs like that. But when I learned about dinosaurs, I was in like primary school in the 80s, and
Sure.
there was like the big five, and they hadn't discovered all these other ones that they have found since. And it was such a humbling thing to have to apologize to him and then buy a dinosaur book and then look at all the dinosaurs together. And my mind was blown. But
Yeah.
imagine if I had taken the stance that no, you don't know what you're talking about. There's only a Stegosaurus, Brontosaurus, Tyrannosaurus, the usual suspects from the 80s. And that's it. So you're
Yeah.
telling a lie. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like that's where we are with politics right now, Adam.
No, I honestly, I think this gets trained in us very early. Over my shoulder here, there's a couple books, one of which is called Rational Parenthood, that blew my mind. And there's another one that's a companion to it called Raising Rational Thinkers. And honestly, it's not any harder than just admitting that we don't know.
Mm,
And how much better if we're, those of us that are children of the 80s and the 70s and so forth, how much would it have been better if our parents would have admitted that they don't know? That
mm,
kind of modeling for a child that says, dad doesn't have the answer. It's okay that dad doesn't have the answer. Where could we go to find the answer? Where could the
mm,
two of us go to go look this up? And how could we find that out, right? And showing the process of asking questions. I think we get used to, and being, my parents were wonderful parents, but they were religious, and I was raised in a religious community where the answers were handed to me on a silver platter. There were answers, and I did not need to ask questions because we had dogma and we had doctrine to answer that for us. But if people are raised in an environment where a parent or a loved one says, let's go see if we can find the answer to this. I don't know the answer to this. I think that we would start to see, I don't know if it would happen overnight, but within a generation, you'd have generations of students that would be used to asking questions
mm,
and would be comfortable with the idea of, I don't know what I'm talking about, so I should probably learn more about this.
mm. And can I ask you a question about your family dynamic? In that, do you think you could have actually successfully been a family who practiced a faith and a religion and rational thinking?
Boy, that's a great question. So my
Because I have
parents,
friends who do. They go to church on
right.
Sundays, and they
Yeah.
are really rational thinkers about a whole bunch of science and other
Yeah.
stuff. Like, they've found a way to balance it, but I'm curious about your experience.
So I had two public school teaching parents. My dad taught high school Spanish, and my mom taught elementary school. So I had both of them as my teachers. We were in rural America, so the amount of resources that I could access were pretty limited. Um, and so, on the one hand, my parents, and especially my mother, instilled in me a love of learning from a very
Mm,
early age. So I loved to read as a kid. I took to books very, very early on. I was a very studious kid. I loved school. It was ingrained in me very early on that doing school well can lead to a successful life.
mm,
So we were doing the kind of rational thing on the side. We were having a lot of, discussions sometimes at the dinner table, sometimes in family trips about subjects that, I mean, for instance, evolution was absolutely a thing in my household that was recognized as being a totally legitimate theory. It was not. My parents didn't dissuade us from learning those things or learning about sex education, for instance. That was not something in my household that we were dissuaded from doing. On the other hand, my parents also were part of a homogenous group of people that believed in this monolithic religion. And it was almost like on Sundays, we would all kind of shut off that part of our brains that was doing the critical thinking, and then we would lean into Mormonism. There was kind of in the background this cognitive dissonance that, okay, there's the secular learning that we're doing on the day to day, but in the background we have the answers. We do know that evolution's a thing and we can talk about evolution, but at the end of the day God created the universe. Or we do know that the universe is eternal and that eventually the sun's going to explode and humans are going to all perish if we last that long. But we also know at the end of the day that Jesus is coming back, and there's this narrative that the second coming is going to happen and we're all going to go to heaven. And those two things, I don't think we ever fully interrogated the dissonance between those two
Mm.
worlds in my family. It was not until I got it well into adulthood that my sister and I, and then my parents soon followed, and my brother as well, that we started to really unpack. Now, wait a minute, these things are not connecting very well.
Right. So your whole family
In
transitioned
in
away.
in a slow iteration, yeah, I
Mm.
was my the process of me leaving Mormonism started very internally. It was when I was a Mormon missionary. I was serving a mission in Southeast Texas. I was 19 to 21 years old, so I was just 2 years. And back then, you were very isolated from your family. You could only call home 2 times a year. You could check your
Whoa.
Yeah, you could check your email once a week at a library, and you could get letters from family. But other than that, I had no contact with my family for 2 years. And it was during that 2 year period that I think the shine of Mormonism started to kind of rub off because I started to, as I talk about in the book, I started to see some things that gave me pause.
Mm.
I had lived. I had prepared myself to be what I thought was going to be the perfect missionary. I have OCD. It's diagnosed. That's not just me saying that I have OCD.
Mm.
I have OCD, and I went into preparing for a mission um, with every intent to be the very best that I could. And
Hmm.
when I got into the mission field and I was around other Mormon men that had prepared for missions, I realized that my experience was very different from theirs, and there was kind of this earth-shattering moment that I thought, well, wait a minute, why are we all not committed to this? Why are we not all playing at the same level? But
Ah, are
that,
you saying some of the guys that were there weren't as into it or felt like they'd been forced to do it, and therefore that
yeah,
created some conversations
yeah,
or questions?
there's a range of within established Mormonism. I mean, there's different offshoot branches, but the main body, the mothership of Mormonism, there's a range of ways to live within Mormonism. And I think what I experienced, because this was the first time I had ever been out of Southeast Idaho, let's just emphasize that.
Mm.
Other than 1 year at college where I had gone in Idaho to a Mormon campus. So even then, I was still very much within the circle. This was my first time ever exiting my homeland, right? And being for the first time cut off from family, cut off from my relatives. I grew up in a town that was made up of all of my cousins and uncles and aunts. I mean, I was around family all the time. And so, for the first time in my life, I was experiencing different walks of life, different ways of living this faith. And I think that's when the cognitive dissonance really just exploded for me. It was this moment of, well, how is this possible? How is it possible that we're all having this range of experiences? But that was very internal. I didn't really communicate any of that with anybody. In fact, we were encouraged, it would have been very problematic if I'd come out and said that I'm having doubts about Mormonism. I mean, my God, that would have had pretty profound impact on my future and whether or not I'd gone even back to college and so forth. So it's most of my exiting Mormonism was an internal struggle that continued into my 20s, continued into my marriage. And then it was the public part of it did not happen until I was a practicing lawyer and had been in practice for a couple of years. And I started to ask questions about why certain high profile excommunications had taken place in the Mormon church. Why was it that people who had, I think, legitimate concerns, why were they kicked out of the faith or disfellowshipped from the community simply by asking questions? And that started a chain of events that then I
Mm.
started to be more publicly a questioner. My wife also started to have those similar questions. And over the period of about 5 years or so, we really explored how much, I mean, how committed were we to this faith? Like how much did we want to do this? And it was having my son. So I only have one, and I will only ever have one child, but
Oh,
having
me
him,
too. Same
yeah,
team. Yep.
yeah, good, single kids, right? But having him was the moment when I said, I can't do this anymore. And that, when I kind of publicly did that, my sister soon followed. My dad kind of came around in within a couple of years. My mom came around a little bit later, my brother, and pretty soon my immediate family. I think most of us have decided that Mormonism is just not for us anymore.
Mm.
Now, extended family is a different story. My wife's family is also a different story. But yeah, my family unit, and I credit it largely to the fact that I think my parents have always valued critical thinking
Mm.
and have always leaned into the idea of discovering new knowledge. And when new knowledge presents itself, we assimilate it, we deal with it, and then we process it and we move
Mm.
forward.
And maybe sometimes that makes you make a change. And maybe sometimes you go, new knowledge, thanks.
Yeah,
Not integrating that for
sure,
whatever reason.
sure.
So then you move away from the Mormon church. Is that then for you something you're vehemently against? Or at that point, when your son is born, are you like, you do you, I'm kind of over here? Because To Hell with Heaven is a pretty strong book title. And I'm curious, and of course, never judging anyone who has a faith of any kind. I'm curious for you where apatheism comes in
Sure. So that's a great
and
question.
why not agnostic,
Right.
as another question.
It's a great question. So let me deal with that in a couple different ways. So first, I will admit that I went through a very angry period, and I
Mm,
do talk about that a little bit in the book. But there was a period of time right before my son was born and a little bit thereafter where I was very angry. I felt that I had been lied to. There's a host of things in Mormon history and Mormon doctrine that just don't add up, and those aspects of it, I felt especially someone lied to me. Someone did not tell me the truth. I didn't blame necessarily my parents because they also were caught up in it too. But I blamed leaders. I blamed the people who had given speeches and talks in generations past. And I thought this was a manufactured reality. And I felt, especially, I think in hindsight now, I recognize that what I was really feeling was a sense of loss. I felt like, where did
mm.
my teens and my 20s go? I gave
How
up all
could it
this.
have been? Was there a bit of coulda, woulda, shoulda in there that
Absolutely.
contributed to the anger? Yeah.
Absolutely. My wife and I went through a very hard period because we got married. It's very common in Mormonism to get married very young because you're encouraged to start a family. There's a host of doctrinal and dogmatic reasons why Mormons encourage that. But my wife and I got married when I was 22 years old and she was 20. So we've been married for 18 years at this point, and I'm, 40. And there was a part of me, and I think her too, that looked at our time together and thought, well, if Mormonism's not true, then is our marriage not true? We got married because of Mormonism, or we would not have gotten married but for Mormonism. And I think there was a period of time where we thought, is our whole life a lie? And did we make choices simply because we thought this is God's plan for us? And that was tough. That was a period of time where I felt like I was grieving the loss of something that could have been, right? If I could have just done my 20s over again, basically. Now I think that's a normal thing that everybody probably hits in their 30s. I think everybody has that, but mine happened to coincide with a faith crisis as well.
Mm,
But I think eventually through couples counseling and through therapy and through unpacking a whole host of other different therapeutic tools, I think where I've landed these days is that the version of the person that I am is a product of all of those things, and I don't hate myself for that. I don't hate who I am. Someone just The last event that I spoke at said, "I'm very sorry for what you went through," and I said, "It made me who I was. I'm not.
Mm.
I don't. I'm not sorry for it. It's who I am."
Yeah, I have a
So,
philosopher friend who always says, if you could, our job is to try to arrive at the thank you to the
mhm,
past as quickly as possible, because for
yeah,
whatever reason it happened,
yep,
and it has made you who you are.
that's right.
And now that you know whatever you know, there's a choice forward.
Absolutely. I think and there's something scientific to this too. Scientists, we can't study the what's called the counterfactual. We can only see the universe as it is. We don't know, for instance, what a different version of Earth would look like. And
Mm-hmm.
playing with that kind of wishful thinking or those hypotheticals is unproductive because at the end of the day, there's no data to go on. So I don't there imagining all the different iterations of my life, those are non-existent. Maybe in some alternate reality they exist, but I'll never know them. So the most I can do is take advantage of the time that I have now and move forward. And sitting in that anger was reducing my ability to move forward. It was
Mm.
preventing me from being a full-fledged person. So this is actually where the apatheism part comes in, and because apatheism, I think, is a good kind of check on that kind of anger that people might have, especially if any of your listeners are going through what we would refer to as deconstruction or deconversion. There is a moment, I think, where people have this grief and they either manifest it through sadness or anger or whatever. So, to kind of help people understand why apatheism versus agnosticism, etc., I want if listeners can kind of understand this basic principle, and I'll use a political analogy to help make it salient. So, when we talk in politics, we often talk in the left-right spectrum, and that's
Mm.
true for pretty much every liberal democracy. You're either on the left or you're on the right, or you're some range in between, right? Now that's helpful. That single axis, that x-axis, is really useful because all it's doing is saying where do you stand on politics? How do you vote, basically? And it's useful because it's very simplistic. It helps us plot people and make some
We can make
conclusions.
sense of them. Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely, and you can identify too.
Mm.
But just asking that question alone, how do you vote, is only one dimension of a person's political life. There's another dimension, we could throw in a y-axis here, where we could say, well, now how active are you in politics? So as opposed to how are you voting, how often are you thinking about politics? How important is politics? So there we can imagine someone who's on the left, but who maybe doesn't care very much, or they might actually care a lot. And in that sense, they agree on the political side. They're similar in that respect, but they're very worlds apart in terms of their activity level. If we only reduce them to the single dimension, it would look as if they're the same. We would plot them on the exact same side. But once we add that y dimension, all of a sudden there's a significant amount of space between them. And it also illustrates, too, that if there is an inactive left leaning voter and an inactive right leaning voter, maybe they share something, maybe there's something similar about them that's not shown in that single axis spectrum. It makes it look as if they're so worlds apart, but maybe actually their inactivity is the bigger thing. Okay. I think
Oh, I
most,
see where you're going.
yeah,
Okay.
so I think
Yep.
most listeners kind of get that
Mm.
phenomenon. We'll do that now in the religious aspect. So the x-axis in the religious aspect is just, do you believe in God or not believe in God? And in the book, I list three questions that essentially we would say, all right, these are what the beliefs are about. But essentially, it comes down to, are you a theist and you believe in a personal, loving God who answers prayers and hears you and moves heaven and earth for you? Or are you an atheist where you believe that there is no God and there can never be a God? And I would hate the idea of there being a God. And then somewhere in between, we can plot people. And agnosticism would be somewhere in the middle where we say, all right, I don't know. I haven't been given evidence yet, but we'll wait and see. All right. That belief part is usually as far as we get when we talk about religion. And that's great. It helps us, again, make simplistic judgments about the world. It helps us identify. It's useful. But that actually might hide something. Just like with the active voter, we could add a y-axis, a second dimension, and say, all right, well, put aside how you believe. Let's ask, how active are you in your religious belief? How committed are you? How much does religion take up a segment of your life? Is it a lot? In which case, the word I use for that in the book is you are a zealot and you're
Mm-hmm.
moving towards the zeal part of it. Or if you don't let religion and spirituality dominate your life, if it's just one aspect, but it's part of a greater whole, then apatheism is probably the word for you. And
Mm-hmm.
so, in that sense, we could imagine someone just like a liberal inactive voter or a liberal active voter. We could imagine someone who is a believer, who is very committed to their beliefs, and they are a zealot theist who's out there doing missionary work, what I was when I was a practicing Mormon. Or you can imagine someone who's a believer who basically says, you know what, I believe, but it's a private thing. I think about it every now and then. But for the most part, career, hobbies, family life, all of these other things, they're just as important to me, or maybe even more so than my inner spiritual life or my religious life. In which case, that person is an apatheist. So
Mm.
the way to describe myself these days, Alex, I see myself as a pretty strong agnostic. I'm open to evidence. So far, the gods that I've encountered in the world haven't persuaded me, but if someone comes along with new evidence, I'll take it. But that's just my belief part of it. On the energy part, the emotional part of this, I'm an apatheist. I don't really think about this stuff very often.
Mm.
For the most part, am not trying to proselytize about my beliefs. I might be proselytizing about apatheism, which is a different thing, but I am not proselytizing about the answer to the question, does God exist? So
Mm-hmm.
that hopefully that I think illustrates it. In the book, I have a little diagram that kind of walks people through this a little bit
Yes, I
more.
saw that. I think that's
But
very helpful.
yeah, but hopefully that explains a little bit about where apatheism fits into all of this.
Mm-hmm. And where do you think apatheism fits into the world today? Like, how does it show up for you in day to day when discussing with colleagues? I'd imagine you've got some theologians in the next wing who are,
Sure, sure.
like at the
Yeah.
university, or maybe you're catching up with friends for a lunch. It happens to be a Sunday. They went to church that morning. How does it actually come up that you're an apatheist
Great.
in your day to day life?
So it's a new word for I think something that's been around for a long time
Mm-hmm.
and we just haven't really identified it. Usually if you get around in Christian circles, for instance, many people refer to them as, lazy Christians or the phrase that was popular in Mormonism was a jack Mormon, a lazy Mormon, right? A
Ah,
Mormon who's
yeah.
just,
I've got
you
a
know,
girlfriend who says I'm a bad Jew because she
yeah,
doesn't go
there you
to
go.
synagogue
There,
or yeah, okay.
Yep, yep,
Mm.
there you go. So I think what we need to do, I think, and this is kind of my next project. I'm working with a couple colleagues to explore this question here in the United States. But my suspicion, and I don't have data on this yet, but my suspicion is that there actually are way more apatheists than there are zealots. I think when we talk in religious terms in the United States, and probably in a lot of developed nations, I think we're oftentimes, because we're only looking at things one dimensionally,
Mm.
we are looking at the world as well, it's atheist versus theists, and it's this religious war that's happening. What I actually think is happening is it's really just zealots fighting with each other. It's zealot atheists or it's zealot theists that are dominating this conversation, and they're probably in the minority. My suspicion is that they're in the minority.
Ah, but they're very loud,
They're loud.
compelling, and that's
Exactly.
fabulous for the tech algorithms these days. So it
Absolutely.
makes it feel like it's
Yep.
a much bigger war, culture
Yep.
war, than it actually is.
Yeah, it sells
Huh.
airtime. It's good for law firms because it's the kind of thing that takes a case to the Supreme Court. I think most people, I have, for instance, a couple Lutheran neighbors. I'm in Wisconsin, so I'm surrounded by Lutherans. There's more Lutherans than there are Jews in Wisconsin by a long shot. And for the most part, the kind of Lutherans that I encounter on a day-to-day basis, they're not throwing their Lutheranism around. They don't filter the world through that lens, and they're not
Mm.
judging their neighbors based on whether or not they're a Lutheran. It's very different from the experience that I had when I was a very, very active Mormon, and I would have judged the world through that lens. I absolutely was a zealot when it came to those religious worldviews. So I think some religions are doing this better than others. But I also think that just the average bloke on the street is probably not consumed every waking moment of their life with religious ideas. But because the narrative is doubled down on this, there's this perception that there must be this religious war. And so I think the way to fight back on this is for apatheists, whether they are believers and non believers, to recognize their shared value. The shared value that is
Mm,
basically, we're going to live and let live. The two things that I talk about in the book is what makes an apatheist a committed apatheist is number one, I recognize something called reciprocity. If I want an accommodation for my beliefs, or if I want the right to live this way, I better give it to you too. I better recognize that you have that ability. And the other part is just passivity.
mm,
It's about reducing the temperature in the room. Eric Chenoweth is a political scientist
yeah.
who studies genocides and revolutions and does a whole lot of work on basically passive resistance versus active resistance. And historically speaking, when you look at successful ways to end a totalitarian regime, you would think that the active resistance would be the thing, showing up with guns, Molotov cocktails, and bombs. But what that does is it actually entrenches the authoritarian. It makes the totalitarian more likely to fight back. The best kinds of resistances in the past are the kinds of passive resistance that just simply says, I don't recognize your authority. I don't recognize your power over me. And an apatheist does that. An apatheist is passive and says, I'm not going to play this game. I'm not going to define you're trying to set the terms of the discussion on religious ideas, and I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to acquiesce to that wordsmithing. And so I think those two things, what I hope to see someday and what my mission is as an academic on this topic is to encourage, if you are an apatheist, to speak up and to say, I look at the world this way, and I think there are more people out there that do. And I think it would counter the narratives that we often see. It would basically say,
Hmm.
actually, we want to return to a world where people kind of live and let live when it comes to religion.
That is so fascinating. And I would say it's the same with politics. It's the
100%.
extreme narratives that get all the airtime. And then there are people like, you do you, I'll do me, but let's just get our kids educated however we see that being the best way forward. And why do you got to come and judge how I'm doing it or try and push a way
Yeah.
for me to do it that
Yeah.
isn't? Yeah,
I
okay.
think so. If you look, for instance, at, and I'm here in the United States, so I'm thinking about the recent election in
Mm,
2024.
there is a
If
lot
you
going on for you guys right now.
There's a lot going on, but
Mm,
if you look at the voting results in many swing states, for the average voter, there are a host of things that everybody agrees on. It doesn't matter whether you're the extreme right, extreme left, or you're somewhere in between. There are a host of things we agree on: free speech, due process, the rule of law, all of those things that are core values of a liberal democracy. I think what oftentimes happens, and so it's no accident that a political philosopher is doing this in a religious way. You're right. This is 100% just, you can see this in the political realm. It's no accident that I think two-party systems or any party system exacerbates the differences.
mm,
Parties, just like corporations, depend on followers. We need people to be committed to our ideology to keep it breathing and to keep it alive. And so, how do we do that? Well, we show you how to belong to the in group. What are the markers of being a part of the team? And then we will double down on those differences and
mm.
exacerbate them as much as possible so that it will activate you and get you to the voting booth. And so what ends up happening is that the average person that's in a neighborhood, I live around people who are liberal, conservative. We talk all the time, and there's a host of things that we just flat agree on. But because our party system exacerbates the differences, it looks as if we're a world apart from one another.
Yeah.
And I think, again, the lesson here is to wake up to the way to fight back on that, to say, I'm not going to play that game. I'm not going to play the difference game. I'm going to find the ways that we share commonality, common ground, and I'm going to fight back in a passive way. I'm not going to be a revolutionary. I'm going to just simply say, I'm not acquiescing to this.
Mm-hmm. But can we get confused sometimes then? Because I look at how many people don't vote in your country at all, with apathy equaling complete inaction.
Yes, absolutely. And I talk about that in the book too, that apatheism does not mean apathy, and
Mm,
being a passive resistance doesn't mean simply being lazy. So pure and simple and this is a feature, I think, of just the English language. We just don't have words that describe different things. And
I
so we
know.
have to,
Sometimes I wish we had the German language or the French language to use that
right,
have all these
right,
extra amazing words. And I'm like,
exactly.
where's our English word for that?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So I think the difference between someone who's just apathetic,
Mm,
that's a person who's not plugged in. That's a person who just simply has decided that nihilism is the way to go. Nothing matters. The world does not matter. There are no values, and who cares, right?
hmm.
That I think is different from someone who says, I'm passively resisting this thing, whatever it is, political, religious, etc. And the way to passively resist it is ironically and maybe paradoxically being more informed about it. I think that there are, for instance, if you look at the segment of people who don't vote and are in my country, there is a slice of them who are just flat lazy, who are just
Mm.
not plugged in, and I acknowledge that they exist. But there's also a slice of people who are non-voters who have looked at this and said, this entire game seems to be stacked against me and I don't know how to make sense of it. I'm overwhelmed or I am feeling piled on, right? Or I'm feeling as if that by not voting, I'm actually sending a message that I'm not going to engage in this at all. And unfortunately, if it's a feature of our electoral systems that we just don't have a way to measure those folks. We can't give them a voice, right? But I describe in the book about how one can be an active apatheist, and I think a person should be. The key is apatheism is indifferent about what? It's indifferent about the role that religion plays in my life. It's not indifferent about is religion dominating public life? That at that point, an apatheist could absolutely fight back and say, I don't want religion in my schools, or I don't want religion in my community, or whatever it might be. Um, at that point, you're no longer an apatheist. You're not living in the apatheist world anymore because you're not directing your apatheistic ideas to that topic anymore. Does that make
Got it.
sense?
Yeah, 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 it does. Can I come back to the word freedom? Because
Sure.
this one really fascinates me. In COVID, obviously, there was the medical freedom very much highlighted, especially with a new technology. A lot of people felt that they didn't have enough information to make a decision either way, and therefore said, because I don't have enough information, I feel I have the right to avoid that vaccine, let's say. Now, I totally get that. I also get the people that think I've got enough information to give it a shot because I kind of, I care for my elderly parents and I live with them. And if this could in any way benefit that situation and give them less of a chance of dying, then I'm going to go for it. Like I can completely understand everybody for their reactions during that time. What I find interesting post COVID is that authoritarian politics seem to have capitalized on this notion of freedom to say, we will make you safe in your freedom on that topic. And I feel like it's almost like, therefore, people then stop questioning them on other topics. And that's how we can get to a place where we're thrilled and relieved that no one's going to force anything on us. And that is healthy to us. And by the way, no judgment. Anyone who's listening, this is not a judgment. It is an observation of what has happened as a critical thinker. I see that. And then I see no one posting in that same group of people about rollbacks on environmental protection, starting logging again, drill, baby, drill, like all the things that are awful for the environment and therefore consequentially for health. One would say the government is also taking away my freedom to breathe clean air as a human
Right.
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 And so I feel like freedom is going through a bit of a blender right now in the health space. And I wondered whether you could help us be better thinkers in terms of what we start sharing, maybe mindlessly, because we've now got that freedom we so desperately wanted.
Yeah.
And, again, I say to anyone listening, I get you wanting that freedom. I get it. But my fear is that when we desperately want any kind of freedom, and this could be about any kind of topic, because I've seen it play out in my history classes at uni, um, is that we can then close our eyes to all the freedoms being removed from other groups of people or even from ourselves in other
Yeah.
ways that we are now blind to because we got the freedom that was the most seductive, like the women in the 70s with the TV dinners.
Yeah. No, I think
Sorry,
this is
I went on a long
no.
time there, but I just had to unpack that because it's fascinating.
No, I think so. This is actually, I think, circles us back to where we sort of began, where
Mm,
this is where I think the cult-like thinking can become a short circuit for critical thinking. So let's lay a foundation as to what I think I mean by freedom. So I like the word autonomy because I think autonomy is
it's
a
a good
really
word.
great way to think about freedom because autonomy has two components, two different kinds of freedom. There's the negative freedom, which is don't shackle me. There's no constraints. Don't get in my way. Don't. It's literally someone's not dominating me. So an example of this would be, let me have free range of movement. Let me move to whatever city I wish. That sort of thing.
Mm,
It's the kind of external freedom. But I think within plenty of philosophical circles, we also recognize that there's something called positive freedom. And positive freedom is the inner freedom. It's the freedom to be a full-fledged person. And there, you need more than just you to become that full-fledged person. Positive freedom is about becoming a whole person. So there, I need access to resources. I need access to a community. I need access to information. Otherwise, so for example, we can imagine the child that's raised in a very isolated cult. They might be they might have a lot of negative freedom in the sense that they're free to do as they wish, but they might not have a lot of positive freedom because they've had a whole host of options that have been cut off the table for them. They're
okay.
not allowed to take in this information. They're not allowed these other life choices. I think what we as people need to do when we're talking about I want my freedom is to recognize, well, which kind of freedom are we talking about here? Are we just simply saying I want the right to do as I wish without someone telling me what to do? Or do I also want the corollary right, which is I also want the chance to be a full-fledged person and have access to all the range of options, the life choices that I would get. And here we're getting into things like economic rights, health rights, educational rights, the kind of empowerment that it says to a kid, nature rolled the dice, you accidentally end up in this household, and now
Mm,
you've got options as to where you can go with your future. I think what's happened, especially because we live in an age where everything is very, very easy to consume and it's designed to be easy to consume, I think we have reduced very complex questions down to a very simple soundbite. So during
mm,
COVID, for instance, if you didn't wear a mask, that was a signal that you were on one side or the other. If you were not, I remember in the first few months of COVID, we weren't sure if it was a surface disease, right? Was the virus sitting on surfaces? Well, we now know it's an airborne disease, and
oh
all
my
the
gosh, I
wipes.
remember like wiping
Yep,
everything and like,
exactly.
yeah, and just going, okay, so we don't need to
Yeah.
do that. Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and that's a feature of science, right? It's a feature of the fact that we just don't know in the moment. And so at the moment we do the hand washing, we do all the things. Um, but there became kind of this uh, because we're so already so political, because we're
Mm,
already leaning one direction or another, those signals, hand washing, wearing a mask, getting a vaccination, it was a signal that you were part of this group versus that group. In the
mm,
United States, for instance, if you chose not to wear the mask, it was a signal to the world that I am not playing on the same team that you are. I'm on this team, right? When in reality, it's probably much more complicated than just reducing it to wear a mask or not.
mm.
And the same is true for a whole host of things. So it's not just COVID, it's also environmental topics like that, like what you were
Mm,
mentioning a moment ago, or pharmaceuticals, for instance. It's not as easy as simply saying, well, take this drug or don't take that drug. It's actually much more complicated.
yeah,
And it might
nothing
be
is
very,
black and white. Yeah.
right. It's
Mm,
might be very individualistic. It requires context, it requires information. And so I think to the extent that a listener, wherever they are, right, on this topic, I think if a listener has decided, I am certain, I'm positive about what I'm supposed to do about my health. I'm
mm,
positive that this is wrong, or I'm positive that this is right. What I would invite those listeners to do is to say, how do you know that you are certain?
mhm,
Where are you getting that certitude from? Because quite frankly, where in the disciplines that I work in, there is no such thing as certainty. There's always this infinitesimal likelihood that we might be wrong and we might just uncover some new information, a new observation that challenges old ways of thinking. And so there are some things that we can stop and say, all right, I'm reasonably likely or I'm probably right about this, and therefore I can operate under that assumption. But being 100% sure of something, I think is a scary place to be.
mm.
And when a party or a corporation or a religious leader is telling you that they're 100% positive about something, that should raise red flags.
Red
That should make a
flag.
person, yeah, that should make someone stop and go, I need more information before I agree to this.
Okay, so question, given people find safety in black and white, like that
Hmm.
appeals to our lizard brain. Let's choose
Yeah.
that camp, and those people are going to
Yep.
make me feel safe, or these people are going to make me feel safe. How do we find safety again if we have
Yeah.
been that type of person in the wiggle room life where
Yeah.
we have that humility to always kind of go, I might not know for sure. I'm going to check it out. And what does the let's check it out process look like?
Yeah, so the lizard part of our brain that we're referring to is really good at inventing things. It's really good at imagining the worst case scenario because that's how we've survived as a species. It's
Mm,
ingrained in us to imagine the worst case scenario. If we hear a sound in the woods at night in the dark, we are going to imagine the worst case scenario because it's the best way to protect us from whatever the threat is. It's what's got us here as a species.
mm-hmm.
So that's great. It's a very powerful tool. But there's also a part of us too that's self-aware. There's a part of us that does meta thinking and is aware that we're thinking those thoughts. I know that I'm having this emotion and I'm aware that I can turn it off if I need to. It's no different than someone who's, say, trying to lose weight or get healthy. We know we want to eat. We know that I would desperately love to go eat the brownies that are sitting upstairs on my kitchen cabinet.
I can't
But
believe you haven't already. Frankly, I can't
right,
have that. How can't have that
absolutely.
stuff in my house?
Right. But that part of me that wants those
Mm,
is checked by the part of me that says, now wait a minute, I know the future me. I know what future me is going to want. And future
mm,
me wants to be healthy. Future me wants to not feel gross tonight when
mm.
I've eaten too many brownies. Future me is aware of the fact that he wants to actually try to lose weight and to improve his lifestyle, right? If we can do that in the nutritional world, we can absolutely do that in a whole host of other worlds too, political worlds.
Nice.
So
Okay.
if someone comes along and says, "All right, here's the big scary noise. Immigrants are coming and taking your jobs," or I don't know, pick your favorite political
Or
topic, right?
Davos is taking over, or
Sure.
America is going to be fascist tomorrow, or like,
Right.
you could pick
Right.
the worst
Pick
of every spectrum of every topic. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mm,
In my circles, right, Republicans are destroying democracy.
mm,
Liberals are trying to end genders, right?
mm.
All of those, the big scary things. It's that voice out in the forest that's saying, all right, now run, right? It's that noise. Well, there's another part of you that can absolutely stop and go, what does future me expect out of this? Does future me want to just revert to running away and out of fear and trying to demand immediate answers to a problematic solution? Or should future me be thinking maybe there's something more, maybe there's something greater that I should be taking into account before I do this? And that greater thing might be, hey, I've got Republican family members or I've got Republican neighbors, and not all of them seem to be Nazis. Or I've got liberal neighbors and liberal members of my family, and they don't seem to be the type of people that are wanting to destroy gender stereotypes or gender roles. So why don't I pause for just a second and think through what that fear or that insecurity is telling me and revert back to those rational ways of thinking
Hmm.
that remind us that actually there's a future version of me that's going to lose something if I give up right now. So, in
Oh,
other words, it's restoring that positive freedom. And we might be losing a little bit in the negative freedom sense, but we might be gaining something greater because now we've got more options in the future.
hmm. That makes me think of a nervous system regulating technique where it's like listen to three sounds, smell three smells, touch three different things around you. Just bring yourself right back to
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
dimension you can process in the here and
Yeah.
now. Feels like
Yep.
that's the remedy is to like, okay, know your Republican neighbor, know your liberal neighbor, know your climate activist neighbor, know your vaccine freedom neighbor, know that you have kids that go to school together and you have a lovely chat on a Monday
Yeah.
morning and
That's right.
come back to that.
Yeah. It
Mm.
really is about, and it's not hokey. It's not, we don't have to, people sometimes will hear it and say, well, that sounds like new agey,
Yeah,
whatever.
I was going to say, like, how do we stop that from sounding like an idealism? Like you live in a make believe world if you think you don't have to pick a side, kind of
But
retort.
the thing with that is that we know from history that picking sides almost always doesn't work out.
Mm,
That inevitably, once you've picked a side, your side is going to start to lose, or your side is going to overreach. I mean, pick any civilization, pick
yeah.
any human civilization in history, and you just whoever the victor is in this moment is going to probably be the loser on the next horizon. So, the way to survive that, the way to not fall into the trap of groupthink is to, if even if it sounds hokey, to be living here and now and to
Mm,
recognizing that I'm in this space with these people at this time, surrounded by these folks. It's exactly what I was talking about earlier with the anger that I'd went through with leaving my religion. Do I want to sacrifice tomorrow for the anger of today? I don't want to do that. I want my tomorrow to be rich and full and vibrant and flourishing. So if that means I'm going to have to give up on the anger and the frustration now and recognize that there's nothing I can do about getting my 20s back, if that just means that I do that, then I'm going to have better 40s, better 50s on into my next decades, right?
mm,
And I think the same is true in the political realm. If it means having to say, all right, for right now, that narrative that's being told to me does not match the kind of people that I'm associating with, then double down on that. Meet those folks. And what I would also say too is that remember that you're being spoon-fed something on social media algorithms. Remember that
mm.
you're by reacting to things, you're teaching this computer code to feed you more information that seems to be triggering you. So come up for air. The phrase that I see amongst Gen Zers is go out and touch grass, right? Go out
Oh, I love
and
that they're saying that. I haven't
yeah,
heard that. That's brilliant.
it's a great one, right? Go
Mm,
out and touch grass, or just go see your neighbor, right? And I think if you just do that, I think that's the beginning of countering the authoritarian narratives,
No matter where they show up, how they pop
right?
up, what
Right.
political side of the spectrum they might be on.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, I think comfort in the gray and comfort in the human connection piece. A lot of the time we're so stressed out. And then you look at the average screen time and you think, well, I think I've got a clue as to why. Not enough
Yeah.
real
Yeah.
time.
Yeah.
Mm,
Exactly. I think if you spend all of your time sitting in an echo chamber of constant stimulation, you are going to feel it's going to feel bad. I've tried, and it's hard to do this. And I want to say this to listeners that I recognize that this is a challenging thing to do. And I've tried to do it myself. This
mm,
year, I've tried to unplug from a lot of social media apps. I've reduced the amount of consumption that I'm doing. It's hard to do because social media and the technology that makes social media possible has now become so intertwined with everything that we do as people that it's almost hard to do your professional life without it.
Yeah,
I mean,
I
here
would
we are
agree.
having, I mean, you and I, we would not have met if we did not
Mm,
have the technology that would make something like this possible. So there are, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not suggesting that we should like claw back to a, 16th century way of living, but it does mean, I think, that we should at least recognize what we're doing. We should not be simply inactively scrolling and passively receiving information, but simply asking ourselves, when was the last time I came up for air? When was the last
mm.
time I went out and touched grass? And maybe I need to go do that.
What a great place to finish. Adam, thank you for helping us explore topics that are muddy and murky and for sharing your personal experience. I think the more we recognize how much of what we do or seek is the lizard brain in play and counter it with touching grass and having a conversation with a real person, I just think that's the real medicine in this day and
I do too.
age.
I do too.
So
Yeah.
I really appreciate your work and
Well,
your time.
thank you for having me. It was a pleasure talking to you, Alex.
I hope you loved today's show as much as I loved bringing it to you. I want to remind you that if you are someone who craves a low tox community that is judgment free, full of empowerment, has health professionals and building health professionals that can support you, as well as me in there answering questions multiple times a week, I want to invite you to join the Low Tox Club. For the price of less than a cup of coffee a month, you have an annual membership for $49 Australian, so it's about $30 US or euro, that allows you to have a member masterclass every single month with a health professional or global expert from the podcast, where we have them to ourselves for an hour to ask questions and deep dive further. You have the beautiful supportive chat group. You have Q&As with me answering questions. We read books and talk about them and a whole bunch more. You can head to lowtoxlife.com, hit the explore tab, and join the club is the very first option on that list. Of course, we have over 10 evergreen courses that you can jump into anytime, whether it's navigating everyday low tox swaps with our Go Low Tox signature course, whether you have kids and you're wanting to know how to best support them with our Low Tox Kids course, whether you're planning a family and looking at a healthy low tox preconception journey, reducing inflammation, especially the chronic kind, with our Inflammation Ninja course, many other courses. You can again head to lowtoxlife.com, hit the courses tab, and you'll see all of the options, which includes a business course, my Low Tox Method program. A lot of people don't know, but I was doing a lot before starting Low Tox Life in 2009, and I was a business consultant across hospitality, health, retail, and cosmetics. I have been in business consulting for a very long time, so I absolutely adore helping people move into the low tox space or develop their low tox businesses. So that's a way I can support you. And then, of course, there's our wonderful social media communities at Low Tox Life on Instagram, and of course, the website with over 250 gluten-free recipes, blogs, downloadable PDFs to help you navigate wanting to get rid of synthetic fragrances in your school or office. I could go on. So head to lowtoxlife.com, see what takes your interest or fancy, and thank you so much for being a part of our podcast community. I love reading your reviews. I appreciate every follow and subscribe, and I want to just remind you to finish off that if there's anything you heard that you found interesting from a medical or scientific perspective, it is intended as education only. Please always chat to a health professional who knows you and your situation best. I'll see you next week. Bye.